The first time my son's fiancée came to my house, she didn't look at the photographs on the wall. She looked at the frames. I noticed it the way you notice a car idling too long on your street, not consciously at first, just a small weight settling somewhere behind your eyes. My son had brought her over for Sunday dinner, the two of them arriving together in his old Jeep, her laughing at something he said before they even got through the door. She was beautiful in the way that demands attention, the kind of woman who walks into a room and rearranges it without touching anything. I shook her hand. Her grip was firm and brief, like a business transaction. "This is a gorgeous home," she said, and her eyes moved across the living room with a precision that didn't match her smile. My wife had passed 4 years earlier. The house still held her in small ways, the blue ceramic lamp she'd picked out, the quilt folded over the arm of the recliner, the row of framed photos along the hallway wall. Renee paused at those photos. She tilted her head slightly, the way you tilt your head when you're reading something, not when you're feeling something. "Is this Daniel when he was little?" she asked, pointing to one. "His 7th birthday," I said. She nodded and moved on. My son was already in the kitchen, opening the refrigerator, calling out that he hoped I'd made the chili because he'd been talking about it all week. I watched Renee move through my living room for another 3 seconds before I followed him. I told myself I was being an overprotective old man. I told myself that for the next 8 months. My name is Robert, and I am 62 years old. I spent 30 years running a mid-sized excavation and site prep company in western Pennsylvania. I am not a warm man by nature, my son would tell you that himself, and he wouldn't mean it as an insult. Just a fact, the way you'd say a mountain is tall. I built things. I read contracts. I learned early that the most expensive mistakes don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, dressed like opportunities. My son Daniel is nothing like me, and everything I hoped he would be. He became an architect, which I think was his gentle way of telling me that he wanted to build things too, but things that lasted differently. He's 33, soft-spoken in rooms full of noise, the kind of man who remembers what you told him 6 months ago and brings it back up naturally, not to impress you, but because he actually listened. His mother used to say he was born with an old soul. I think she just meant he was kind. And in this world, that sometimes reads the same way. He met Renee at a work event. She was in marketing for a firm that had hired his architecture company on a commercial project. They dated for 5 months before he told me about her. That should have told me something right there, because Daniel tells me everything, always has, even when the everything is uncomfortable. The fact that he held on to this one for 5 months without mentioning it meant something was already different. I didn't recognize that at the time. I file it now under the long list of things I missed. Their relationship moved fast from the outside. Within 2 months of meeting her, he was having dinner at her apartment 3 nights a week. Within 4, he had a drawer there. When he brought her to my house that first Sunday, and I watched her eyes scan my living room, they had already been together for 7 months. He looked at her the way my wife used to look at the garden after the first spring thaw, like something he'd been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. I wanted to love her for him. Over the next several months, I tried. I invited them both to every family occasion I could manufacture: Thanksgiving, Christmas, his cousin's graduation party in April. Renee was always charming in company, the kind of charming that requires an audience. She remembered people's names on second meetings, asked follow-up questions about things you'd mentioned before, laughed at the right moments. My sister-in-law told me at Christmas that she thought Renee was wonderful, that Daniel had finally found someone who matched him. I smiled and agreed and helped myself to another cup of coffee. What I could not explain and could not shake was the feeling I had whenever Renee and I were briefly alone. It was never long. She was skilled at ensuring it wasn't. But in those 30-second gaps between Daniel leaving a room and returning, something changed in her. Not dramatically, not in any way I could have described to someone and had them take seriously. The warmth didn't leave her face entirely. It just became optional, like a light on a dimmer, turned down just enough to remind you it was always controlled. I had one conversation with Daniel about it. One. I took him out for breakfast on a Saturday in February, just the two of us, and I tried to be careful about how I framed it. I told him I thought Renee was impressive. I told him she was clearly smart. Then I told him, as gently as I could manage, that I sometimes got a feeling I couldn't put my finger on, that I wasn't sure I always knew what she was thinking. He was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee. "Dad," he said finally, "she's not Mom." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and we finished breakfast talking about something else. He was right, of course. She wasn't his mother, and I had loved his mother with a completeness that I think had permanently altered my ability to see other women clearly, either too softly or too harshly, with very little in between. I accepted that I might be the problem. I folded the feeling up and put it somewhere I thought I could leave it alone. Then Daniel missed his cousin's birthday dinner. It was a small thing. A backyard cookout in June for his cousin, who was turning 30, the kind of event our family had never skipped in 30 years of holding them. Daniel had confirmed he was coming. He didn't show up. When I called him that evening, he picked up after several rings and sounded distracted, slightly off, like a man conducting two conversations at once. "Renee wasn't feeling well," he said. "I didn't want to leave her alone." I said I understood. I asked if she needed anything. He said no, she was fine. It was just a headache. I said okay and told him we'd missed him and hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment after the call ended, looking at nothing in particular. That was the first one. Over the following 3 months, there were 6 more. A nephew's graduation, a 4th of July gathering at my house that he'd helped me plan, 2 family dinners, a weekend trip to see his uncle in Ohio that he and I had been planning for almost a year. Each time, there was a reason. Renee was sick, or stressed about work, or they had plans he'd forgotten to mention. Each reason was individually reasonable. Together, they formed a shape I recognized from 30 years of reading contracts. The slow, systematic removal of something from its original context. I started paying attention differently. I noticed that when I called Daniel in the evenings, he often took a moment to pick up, and when he did, his voice carried a particular kind of careful quality, measured in a way that his voice had never been with me. I noticed that when we did see each other, he checked his phone more than he used to, and not casually. I noticed that when I asked him how things were going, he answered with a performance of fine that was just slightly over-rehearsed. I am not a man who talks about intuition. I've spent my life in an industry that runs on soil reports and load calculations and things you can measure and prove. But I have also spent 62 years on this earth and raised a child alone for the last 4 of them, and I know my son's baseline the way I know my own yard. Something was wrong. In September, I drove to his apartment unannounced. I know that's not something you're supposed to do with grown children. I did it anyway. Daniel answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, which was normal, but something in his face when he first saw me, a flicker of something that might have been relief or might have been anxiety, too fast to name was not. He let me in. Renee was there, on the couch with her laptop, and she smiled at me with precisely the warmth the situation required. "Robert," she said, "what a nice surprise." The apartment had changed. That was the first thing I registered, below the conscious level, like a change in the weather before the clouds arrive. Daniel's bookshelves, which had always been organized in the particular chaos that was entirely his architectural theory, next to worn paperback novels, next to his mother's old recipe book that he'd taken when I offered it, had been reorganized. Clean, matching bins on the lower shelves. The recipe book was not visible. His drafting table, which had always sat near the window where he could see the street, had been moved against the interior wall. In its place, Renee had set up a second desk. I stayed for 40 minutes. Daniel made coffee. Renee engaged me in the kind of polished conversation that never goes anywhere and never intends to. When I left, Daniel walked me to my car. We stood beside it in the parking lot, and he looked at me for a moment with an expression I will spend the rest of my life trying to describe accurately. It was the expression of a man who wants to say something, standing inside a room with no doors. "You look tired," I said, because I couldn't say what I actually meant, and I needed to say something. "I'm fine, Dad," he said. "Just a lot going on with work." He hugged me before I got in the car. He held it a beat longer than usual. I drove home and sat in my driveway for 10 minutes before I went inside. In October, he called me to tell me he and Renee were engaged. I said, "Congratulations." I asked him if he was happy. He said yes. I asked when they were planning to celebrate with the family. He said Renee wanted to have an engagement party, something small, just close friends and family, at their apartment in about 6 weeks. I said I would be there. I asked him if we could have breakfast soon, just the two of us. And he said yes, of course. He'd look at his schedule and let me know. He never followed up. I didn't push it. The engagement party was on a Saturday evening in late November. I arrived 20 minutes early out of a habit I've never been able to break early. Is on time. On time is late. Late is unacceptable. My father drilled that into me, and I drilled it into Daniel. He answered the door in the blue button-down I'd given him for his birthday. And he looked good. Genuinely good. And for a moment I let myself believe I had been wrong about everything. There were maybe 30 people in the apartment. I knew roughly half of them, Daniel's cousin and her husband, his friend from college, a couple of the guys he'd worked with for years. The other half were from Renee's side, her friends and colleagues and a few relatives, all of them occupying the apartment with the easy ownership of people on their own territory. Renee moved through the room like she had choreographed it. She introduced me to people, fetched me a drink, touched Daniel's arm at regular intervals in a way that looked like affection and functioned like a check-in. I watched her the way I had learned to watch things not directly, but peripherally. The way you watch a load-bearing wall for cracks while you're talking to the foreman about something else. Around 7:30, Daniel's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was across the room in conversation. He didn't see it. I was standing near enough to see the screen light up, not the notification contents, just the light. And I watched him glance toward it a moment later from across the room. He extracted himself from his conversation with an ease that was too practiced, crossed to the counter, picked up the phone, and looked at it. Something moved across his face. He glanced up and found Renee in the room. She was talking to someone and didn't turn around. He looked back down at his phone. Then he looked at me, just for a second. Then he looked away. 30 minutes later, I was standing near the hallway that led to the bathroom, talking to his cousin's husband about something I cannot now recall, when Daniel appeared beside me. "Hey, could you help me with something in the back room?" he said. "Something with the speaker set up. It keeps cutting out." His cousin's husband offered to help too. Daniel said no. It was fine. It was just a wire thing. He just needed an extra set of hands. He'd be right back. The cousin's husband went to find his wife. Daniel and I walked down the hallway. There was no issue with the speaker setup. He closed the door of the small back bedroom and stood in the middle of it and looked at me. And what I saw on his face then was nothing like the careful performances of the past several months. He was 33 years old, and he looked 20 years younger and 20 years older at the same time. And I knew before he said a word that I had not been wrong. "Dad," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." I said, "Okay." He sat down on the edge of the bed. He put his hands together between his knees and looked at the floor for a moment and then back up at me. "I found something," he said, "on her laptop. 3 weeks ago?" I wasn't snooping. I was using it because mine was charging and I needed to send an email, and she has this folder just sitting on the desktop, labeled with my name. I sat down next to him. What was in it? "Financial documents," he said. Or they weren't documents exactly. They were screenshots of my bank statements, my investment account summaries, the property records for the building my firm owns shares in. He stopped. There was also a document. She'd written it herself. It was like a timeline, with dates and figures. I felt a stillness come over me that I recognized from moments in my professional life when a site assessment revealed something catastrophic below the surface. The particular quiet of understanding how serious something is. "What kind of timeline?" I said. "After the wedding," he said. She had it laid out. How long after the wedding to start the conversations about me buying her out of her current lease. Then buying a house, she had specific neighborhoods listed, specific price points. Then she had notes about my firm, about the partnership buy-in process, whether a spouse could make a claim on professional assets in Pennsylvania. He said the last part like he was reading from something he'd memorized, because he couldn't believe it otherwise. "Daniel," I said. "I know," he said. "I know." I put my hand on the back of his neck. the way I used to do when he was small and something had frightened him, not squeezing. Just present. Just wait. He didn't pull away. "Why didn't you call me?" I asked. "Because I didn't," he stopped. Started again. "Because I needed to be sure I wasn't losing my mind. Because the last few months, I felt like I couldn't trust my own." He stopped again. "She has this way of explaining things, of making you feel like the thing you noticed wasn't what you thought it was. I've spent the last 3 years watching myself second-guess things I was certain of. I didn't trust my own read on this. I thought about the breakfasts we didn't have, the visits that had grown shorter and less frequent, the careful voice on the phone. I thought about what it takes to make someone distrust the things they know to be true about their own life. And I thought about how long and quiet that kind of work is, and how it doesn't look like anything from the outside." "Do you have the documents?" I asked. "I photographed everything before I closed the folder," he said. "I've been carrying it for 3 weeks. Going through the party tonight like everything is fine." He looked at me. I almost didn't say anything. I almost just went through with it because he shook his head. "I don't know. I don't know what's wrong with me." "Nothing is wrong with you," I said. "Not one thing." We sat there for another minute. Through the closed door, I could hear the party voices, music, someone laughing at something, the ordinary sound of a celebration for something that needed to be stopped. "What do you want to do?" I said. He was quiet for a long moment. "I want it to be over," he said. "I want my life back. I want to feel like myself again." He looked at me. "I want you to help me." I thought about the best way forward, not the most dramatic way, not the most satisfying way, in the short-term sense of satisfaction that looks good but doesn't hold. Daniel was the one who had to walk out of this apartment tonight and then continue to live his life. Whatever happened next had to protect him, not just expose her. "All right," I said. "Here's what we're going to do." We spent 12 minutes in that back room. When I had heard everything and he had heard my plan, we went back out to the party. I got myself another drink. I talked to his colleague about a project they'd just won. I ate something from the cheese board and complimented the host, Renee's friend, who had helped organize it, on how nicely everything had come together. I watched Renee for the rest of the evening with the new clarity of a man who has had his read confirmed and is no longer at war with his own perception. She was good. I will give her that. She was genuinely, technically good, the warmth deployed with precision, the small, affectionate gestures toward Daniel calibrated to create a visible picture without requiring genuine feeling behind them. She was managing the room the way I had once managed job sites. Everything accounted for, everyone in their designated position, the whole operation looking effortless because the effort was invisible. Around 9 o'clock, I asked if I could have everyone's attention for a moment. Renee looked at me from across the room. Something passed through her eyes too fast to name, gone before it registered on her face. She smiled. "I am not a speech-making man," I said that first, which got a laugh, because the people in the room who knew me knew it was true. I said I had known Daniel his entire life, and had watched him become the kind of man that most fathers only hope for, careful, principled, the kind of man who thinks before he acts and means what he says. I said that a man like that deserves someone who sees him clearly and wants him for exactly who he is. I paused there, long enough to be noticeable. I said that before we toasted to an engagement, I wanted to ask Daniel directly, in front of everyone who loved him, a question I should have asked more carefully a long time ago. I looked at my son. I said, "Are you sure this is what you want? Not what makes sense on paper. Not what's already in motion. Are you genuinely sure?" The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they sense something real is happening. Daniel stood next to Renee. He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked at the people around him, his cousin, his friend from college, the guys from his firm. He looked at the room that Renee had filled with her people and her version of his life. And then he did something I had watched him do as a child when he knew what the right answer was, but knew the right answer was going to be hard. He squared his shoulders. "No," he said, "I'm not. There are silences, and then there are silences." This was the second kind, the kind that has weight and edges. Renee's expression moved through 3 phases in approximately 2 seconds. The smile holding, then the smile recalibrating, Then the smile giving way to something I had seen in those 30-second gaps when we'd been briefly alone and she didn't think it mattered. The warmth becoming optional. The dimmer switch. "Daniel," she said, and her voice was very controlled. "I found the folder," he said. He didn't say it loudly or dramatically. He said it the way he says most important things, quietly, directly, without performance. I saw the timeline. I took photos of everything in it. A sound went through the room. Not collective, exactly individual people processing at individual speeds. I watched Renee make her calculation. I had watched enough people realize that a position was indefensible to recognize the moment they accept it and begin considering the next move instead. It took her about 4 seconds. She was fast. She was genuinely fast. What she tried first was reframing. She said the folder was from a previous relationship, research she'd done for a friend who had been going through a difficult divorce. She'd forgotten it was even there. This was a misunderstanding. She said it calmly, without panic, pivoting to the new position with a smoothness that might have worked in a smaller room with fewer witnesses. Daniel took out his phone. He had sent the photographs to his email from the back bedroom. He read from them, dates, figures, the specific language she had used, words like leverage and asset position and timing, the petition written in a document titled with his name, about his life, about the life she had been planning to dismantle from the inside. Her second attempt was anger. She said he had violated her privacy, that going through someone's personal files was a betrayal, that she couldn't believe he was doing this tonight, in front of everyone. She said it with enough heat that 2 or 3 people in the room visibly flinched, the kind of heat that is designed to make the other person defensive, to shift the question from what she did to what he did, to put him on trial for the method of discovery rather than the substance of what was discovered. Daniel didn't get defensive. He just waited. I have never been prouder of my son than I was in that moment, watching him stand still in the middle of a fire she was trying to start around him. When she finished, he said, "I need you to leave." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I held her gaze. She left. 2 of her friends went with her after an uncomfortable minute of whispered conference near the door. The rest of the room resettled slowly, the way a surface resettles after something has been pulled out from under it. I helped Daniel say goodbye to the remaining guests. His cousin stayed, and so did his college friend, and the 3 of them sat in the kitchen after everyone else had gone, and I made coffee, and we talked until almost midnight. His friend said, "How long have you known something was off?" And Daniel said, "Longer than I admitted to myself." He looked at his coffee cup. I kept explaining it away. Every time something felt wrong, there was a version of it that felt like my fault, my insecurity, my problem. I think I was so afraid of losing something that I talked myself into not seeing what I was actually looking at. "That's not weakness," his cousin said. "I know," he said. "I know that now." He looked at me. "I should have called you sooner." "You called me when you were ready," I said. "That's enough." He was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about the last year. How much of it was?" He stopped. How much of who I was in that relationship was me, and how much of it was what she was shaping me into. I had thought about this myself in the weeks after, about how it works not with force, which would be visible, but with gradual replacement. The bookshelf reorganized. The drafting table moved. The family dinners slowly dropped one by one, each absence individually explainable, collectively a restructuring. The phone calls with me that became more careful, more performed, the easy, honest voice of my son, slowly replaced by a man monitoring himself in real time. None of it dramatic, all of it effective. "You'll figure out where the line is," I said. "It'll take some time, but you'll find yourself again. You haven't gone anywhere." He nodded slowly. Then, "I know I was the one who had to say it tonight, but I need you to know, if you hadn't asked the question, I'm not sure I would have. I had the photos, I had the evidence, and I still might have." He shook his head. "I think I needed someone to give me permission to trust myself." The recipe book was still missing from his bookshelf. I noticed it again when I was getting my coat to leave. I mentioned it, casually, and he looked at the shelf for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read. She said it was cluttering up the display, he said. It's your mother's book, I said. I know. I took it down from whatever Renee had replaced it with a pair of matching dark green bookends, holding up a row of design magazines, and I carried the recipe book over to him and put it in his hands. He looked at it for a moment, at the worn cover and the handwriting on the first page, where his mother had written the date she received it and her full name in her careful looping script. He held on to it. The weeks after were not simple. They are not simple now. Several months further on, Daniel moved through the process of disentangling from a long relationship with the same deliberateness he brings to everything, not quickly, but honestly. He reached out to his cousin, his friend, the family members he had slowly drifted from. Each conversation was its own small reckoning. Each one moved something back to where it belonged. He told me once, during one of our breakfasts, we have them every Saturday now, same diner, the same corner booth, that the thing he found hardest to process was not what Renee had done, but what he had allowed to happen to himself. That he had seen enough and felt enough to know something was wrong and had spent 2 years outrunning his own perception. That it had taken feeling like he had no doors left to walk through before he let himself reach for one. I told him I understood that. I told him I had done the same thing in my one conversation with him over breakfast in February, when I had the words I needed and said the wrong ones instead. That I had let him tell me I was just comparing her to his mother and had accepted the premise because it was easier than the alternative. I should have pushed harder, I said. He shook his head. You couldn't have gotten there before I was ready. That's the thing I've had to accept nobody could have. Not you, not my cousin, not anyone who loved me. The only person who could have gotten there sooner was me. I thought about that for a long time afterward. About how the people we love can drift into something dangerous so gradually that the drift looks like growth from the outside, and how we can see the wrongness of it and still be unable to reach across that distance until they are ready to reach back. About how sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is stay close enough that when they finally reach out a hand, in a hallway at a party, on the edge of a bed in a room with no doors, you're still there to take it. He is doing better now. He moved his drafting table back to the window. The recipe book is on the shelf between an architecture text and a worn paperback novel. And when I visit, which I do more often now, announce this time I can see it from the front door. Last weekend, he came to my house for Sunday dinner. Just the two of us. He made the chili, which he has learned from his mother's recipe, and he made it exactly right. And we sat at the kitchen table talking for 3 hours about nothing consequential work, a project he was excited about, a book he'd been reading, a question he had about some property investment I'd made in the 90s. Easy conversation, the kind we used to have before it became careful. The kind that doesn't need to go anywhere, because it's already exactly where it should be. Before he left, he stopped at the row of photographs in the hallway. He stood there for a moment, looking at them, really looking, the way you look at something you're feeling, not cataloging. I miss her, he said. I stood next to him. So do I said. Every day. He looked at the photograph of himself at 7, at the wide, ridiculous grin above the birthday cake, at his mother's hand resting on his shoulder. He was quiet for a moment. I think about what she'd say, he said. About all of this. I thought about it too. My wife was a woman who had very little patience for people who mistook control for love, who understood the difference between someone who wants to be with you and someone who wants to have you. She was also a woman who understood something I had spent my whole life struggling to accept, that the people we love are allowed to find their own way out of things, and the best we can do is make sure they know the door home is never locked. She'd say you did the right thing, I said, and she'd be glad you let me help. He nodded. He hugged me at the din. I listened to his car start in the driveway and watched the headlights sweep across the yard as he turned out onto the road, and I stood there for a moment in the quiet of my house, in the blue light from the ceramic lamp my wife had picked out. And I felt something that I want to be careful not to overstate, but cannot honestly understate. Gratitude. The plain, solid, unremarkable gratitude of a man who still has his son. I almost missed it. That's what I keep coming back to, in the months since. Not in a way that punishes me. I've been through enough in 62 years to know that self-punishment is just delay dressed up as reflection. But in the clear-eyed way of a man who has read enough contracts to know that you can understand a mistake fully and still learn from it. The first time my son's fiancée came to my house, I watched her eyes move across the room with a precision that didn't match her smile, and I knew something was wrong, and I let myself be talked out of knowing it. The second time I let myself know it, I stayed with it. I didn't perform certainty I didn't have. I didn't make ultimatums. I just stayed close and asked the question when there was a room full of people and a son who needed someone to hand him permission to trust what he already knew. That's all it was. That's all I did. Sometimes that's enough.